Hello everyone. So, I have a shit ton of videos hot on the press right now, and they all relate to one another within a common theme. One by Non-Compete, one by The Radical Reviewer, and the last by Bad Mouse Production. I'm currently working on them, and they should be up by the end of this month. However, while I was going over them, I made a rather interesting observation, and I believe that if libertarians took this into consideration, then it would be more difficult to misrepresent our political ideas, and it would make them more appealing to a wider audience. We need to disassociate from capitalism. Nah, I'm just fucking with you. Well, I'm being dead serious, but I phrased that in a way which was meant to imply something different entirely. The label, capitalism, is what we need to disassociate from. And yes, to clarify, I haven't changed any of my beliefs. I haven't turned into a filthy, violent collectivist. Being honest, this is a problem which I've observed for a long time in debate between self-professed capitalists and anyone who's even remotely critical of what they call capitalism. And at least as far back as late 2017, I was becoming increasingly critical of this argumentative framework. The moment I began to see problems with the term capitalism was in a debate that I had back on Twitter with a Keynesian, and the Keynesian in question identified as a capitalist, which, of course, we are about as opposed as could be, but there was no logically consistent rebuttal to this affiliation with Keynesianism, and this is because capitalism is a political term, designed to be as vague as possible, encompassing so many different ideas and systems that it effectively has a different meaning to each individual person. So similar to the term democratic socialism in modern use, capitalism is a meaningless newspeak term which is designed to describe as vague a set of principles as possible, while simultaneously being broad to where it can encompass virtually any system which deals with trade. This means when talking about the economy and mainstream politics, the debate has been rhetorically structured in a way where any and every idea proposed is capitalist, even if it's something along the lines of corporate tax subsidies, where the majority of economists would oppose it while describing their ideas as capitalist. To the point where the term capitalism could also be used to describe government programs in mainstream use, which is one of the main problems libertarians run into. This has consequently had two effects on mainstream discourse. It's created a generation of people who think that the ills of society all trace back to the existence of commerce itself, and therefore have come to the conclusion that economic central planning is the only viable solution, since centrally planned systems are the only ones not associated with capitalism, according to mainstream political discourse. This has made discourse regarding economics in the mainstream near impossible to have, since the term capitalism is not designed to represent ideas as previously established and evidenced by the deliberate vaguity and broad net of conflicting principles the term is used to represent, to the point where many of the ideas it represents are self-contradictory, i.e. the monetarist view of interest rates versus the Austrian view of interest rates. Because of this, when describing your ideas as a self-professed capitalist, the best case scenario that will come out of that is your entire debate will boil down to trying to simply define what the hell it is that you're actually talking about, rather than the principles you want to discuss. But more so, it creates tribalism between the market advocates and the central planners, specifically on the part of the central planners, because using terminology as described by mainstream politics, the only alternative to central planning is capitalism, and capitalism encompasses all of these principles that you don't like, even though not every self-professed capitalist would support those principles and would argue against them. And government programs, which themselves are not critical to the function of a market, but do heavily influence the market system and are therefore affiliated with capitalism according to mainstream political discourse. Which would mean that specific individual propositions can both support and oppose capitalism. In this specific case, government programs can be associated with capitalism according to mainstream political discourse, but also government programs are the solution to problems caused by capitalism. Therefore, capitalism as a political label defies the law of non-contradiction, meaning that someone seeking to be logically consistent must reject the label, not just on the grounds grounds that political terminology like capitalism defies the entire purpose of language, which is to be easily understood by the person you're communicating with, but because capitalism carries so many different meanings to where they begin to contradict one another, continuing to use the label itself is therefore a logical fallacy, specifically the fallacy of equivocation. This wouldn't be the case if the term itself had come into existence with a specific set of principles it aligned with and itself was an ideology, but since the term was first used in an apolitical context by the Hollandish Mercurius in 1633 to refer to owners of capital, even in etymology, capitalist is not an ideological term, and people hailing from many different ideological stances are on the record around that period of time, using the term simply to refer to the ownership and exchange of capital. David Ricardo, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and Arthur Young being just a few of the examples. The modern political use of the term is a purely socialist construct and started when socialists in the mid-1850s began trying to collectivize people into groups which they referred to as classes based on their material wealth, similar to how social justice advocates have created the term whiteness to collectivize white people behind a single interest and ideology, or patriarchy to collectivize all men behind a single interest and ideology. Capitalism is a Marxist invention used to collectivize people behind a single economic status into a single ideology or interest. Austrian economists have their own consistent but conflicting argument for what capitalism is, which is what Rothbard's basis for coining the term anarcho-capitalism was. The same rule goes for any other market-based economic ideology as well. Now, this was a really boneheaded move. Could you imagine if anti-feminists started referring to themselves as patriarchists? Because that's about equivalent to a supporter of a market system calling themselves a capitalist. But it's especially dumb on the part of the Austrians, since we already have a term that describes what we believe in, and that term wasn't deliberately designed to be a politically charged buzzword that doesn't refer to a specific set of principles while simultaneously referring to anything and everything that the person using the term wants it to. Voluntarism. And this is what I suggest libertarians and anarchists start referring to their economic ideas as. It's not a political term and actually comes with a consistent singular set of principles which are undeniably incompatible with statism in every regard, since as the term implies, all associations in this economy are not coercive. This would basically just be a description of how association worked in an anarchist society. Ancaps would also see less resistance from the so-called anti-capitalist crowd, since voluntarism is not associated and unmistakably has nothing to do with the current statist economy or anything that the state does. Also, unlike the term anarcho-capitalist, where the term implies that there could only be one economic model, communists and socialists would be more receptive to voluntarism, since it would be more clear that they could simply establish their own communes and be left alone. We have historical evidence of this, by the way. Murray Rothbard did not come up with his ideology out of the blue. As a matter of fact, he's openly stated on numerous occasions that his ideology was simply a modification to those proposed by Lysander Spooner and Benjamin Tucker. Rothbard was so inspired by Spooner particularly that he created a compilation of what he thought were Spooner's greatest essays entitled Let's Abolish Government. Both Lysander Spooner and Benjamin Tucker were open advocates of property rights, opponents to democracy, and collective-based entitlements. Gee, sound a lot like what we would describe today as anarcho-capitalists, don't it? Well, at the time, they referred to themselves simply as anarchists, and in conventional discussion, Spooner and Tucker are known simply as individualist anarchists, which the ideological left was just fine with and happily claimed both Tucker and Spooner as their own, going as far as to try and revise history in order to claim that Spooner was a member of First International, despite the fact that there is no documented evidence of this claim, and given that he openly opposed everything that Marxism stands for, I find that to be highly doubtful, especially since the only historian who's ever claimed this was George Woodcock, a collectivist social justice advocate who's known for writing historical revisionist fluff pieces about revolutionary Catalonia, which can be shown to be demonstrably inaccurate. But the point is that the left, for nearly a century, were more than happy to associate themselves with Spooner, Tucker, and any other individualist anarchist, even though they believed in essence the exact same things that Murray Rothbard did in principle. Of course, they would have a few slight disagreements over little issues, as I'm sure everyone does. Hell, I have some small disagreements with all three of them. Then Rothbard came along and associated his take on the exact same set of principles with the dreaded C word. And now, because of that, you have an ideology which is more famous for the straw man memes created about it than the principles it represents. Now, because voluntarist anarchism is redundant, because voluntarism is the state of nature that exists as a result of the government being abolished, I simply think Ancap should just start referring to themselves as anarchists. As both Tucker and Spooner have explained, anarchist societies cannot have a centralized and monopolistic institution which coerces people into having their property forcibly taken from them, as this is simply just another government. And you can't get around this by justifying the actions of the said monopolistic entity by way of mob rule, as you still have no justification or explanatory power for its coercive actions. There is no clear definition of what a group is, let alone an explanation of rights being assigned to groups, and because groups are simply artificial constructs, any right they claim to have is being provided to them by individuals in a positive sense, and since the group in question is claiming to be entitled to these things, it is by extension claiming to be entitled to control individuals, which is slavery and taken to its natural conclusion requires the coercive apparatus of a state in order to stop dissenters who may resist. Or in short, collectivist anarchism doesn't exist, and in an anarchist society, there are only individuals, their associations, and the product of their actions. How they choose to manage, or what they choose to do, is entirely up to them by right of self-ownership. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you all for watching. Until next time.